You are hungry, not hungry in the modern sense, not the specific, mild, socially acceptable hunger of someone who has missed lunch and is starting to think seriously about what to order for dinner. Not the hunger that is solved by opening a refrigerator or walking to the nearest of the approximately 17 food establishments within a 5-minute radius of wherever you currently are. Hungry in the other sense, the older sense, the hunger of a body that has not eaten since yesterday morning, that has been moving through a landscape for several hours in the specific, focused way of an animal that needs food and knows that finding it is entirely its own responsibility, and that the landscape, this particular stretch of savanna on the eastern edge of the African continent approximately 70,000 years ago, is not going to provide it automatically, conveniently, or with any particular consideration for your preferences. There are no farms, there are no stores, there are no governments, no cities, no writing systems, no money, no organized religion in the institutional sense, no division of labor beyond the most basic, no accumulated surplus of food that can be redistributed to the hungry. There is the landscape, and there is you, and there are the other members of your band. Approximately 25 people, give or take, the specific group size that the evidence suggests was the typical social unit of the human hunter-gatherer. And between all of you, the problem of food needs to be solved today, as it needed to be solved yesterday, and as it will need to be solved tomorrow. This is the baseline of human existence, not the civilization that came after, not the farming and the cities, and the writing, and the law, and the art, and the philosophy, and the technology that the past 12,000 years have produced in such extraordinary abundance. The baseline, the condition in which Homo sapiens spent the vast majority of its existence as a species. Approximately 300,000 years of anatomically modern human history, of which only the last 12,000 represent the agricultural and civilizational period that we think of as the whole story. Put it another way, if the entire history of anatomically modern Homo sapiens were compressed into a single calendar year, civilization would appear on December 28th. Everything that the history books typically describe, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the modern world, would occupy the last 4 days of the year. The other 361 days would be the period this script is about. What did humans do during those 361 days? The popular imagination has two answers to this question, and both of them are wrong in instructive ways. The first answer is the brutish one. Humans before civilization were savages, living in a state of constant violence and deprivation. Their lives nasty, brutish, and short in the specific Hobbesian formulation that has shaped Western thinking about the pre-civilized past for 4 centuries. The second answer is the romantic one. Humans before civilization were noble savages, living in harmony with nature and with each other, uncorrupted by the greed and hierarchy and alienation that civilization introduced. Both answers tell you more about the anxieties of the people proposing them than about the actual lives of the people they purport to describe. The actual answer, the answer that the archaeology, the anthropology, the comparative study of recent hunter-gatherer societies, and the increasingly detailed genetic and isotopic record of ancient populations are beginning to reveal, is considerably more interesting than either the brutal or the romantic version. The actual answer is that humans before civilization were doing what humans do, solving problems, maintaining relationships, raising children, managing conflict, creating beauty, telling stories, making sense of the world they inhabited, and finding ways to live together in small groups with the specific combination of cooperation and competition that the human social animal has always displayed. They were not primitive in the sense of incomplete or inferior. They were people, fully modern people, with the same cognitive capacities, the same emotional range, the same social intelligence, the same capacity for creativity and humor and grief that you have. They were just doing it in a different material context, and the material context produced a different kind of life than the civilization that followed. Not a worse life in every respect. and not a better life in every respect, but a genuinely different one whose specific character is worth understanding on its own terms. This is the story of those 361 days. Let's go back and live them. Chapter 1. The band, the social unit that made everything possible, and how it actually worked. You are not alone. This is the first and most important thing to understand about human life before civilization. It was not a solitary existence. The image of the lone prehistoric human, the isolated self-sufficient individual surviving by their own wits against a hostile world, is one of the most persistent and most wrong images in the popular mythology of the deep past. Humans before civilization were intensely, comprehensively social, and the social group was not an optional feature of the pre-civilized life, but its fundamental unit. The band was the basic social unit of the hunter-gatherer world, not the tribe. The tribe is a larger and more organizationally complex entity that emerged with the greater population densities that more productive environments or incipient food production permitted. The band was smaller, typically 15 to 50 people, with 25 being the frequently cited central tendency that the comparative ethnographic data from studied hunter-gatherer societies tends to produce. 25 people. Think about what that means in practical terms. You know everyone in your social world by name, by face, by personality, by history. You know who is reliable and who is not. You know who is a skilled tracker and who is a skilled plant identifier and who is the person you want around when someone is injured because their calm and their knowledge in that situation has been demonstrated before. You know who tends toward conflict and who tends toward resolution, who tells the best stories, who can be trusted with a secret and who cannot. This intimacy, the comprehensive, detailed, personally specific knowledge of every member of your social group, was the social foundation of the pre-civilized world, and it had profound implications for how the group functioned. The reputation system of the band was not the abstract, institutional reputation system of civilization. The credit score, the professional reference, the legal record, but the direct, personal, experientially grounded reputation of people who had watched you perform over years. There was no cheating this system, because the system was the accumulated memory of 25 people who had been watching you their entire lives, and who would continue watching you for the rest of theirs. The size of the band was not arbitrary. It was, to a significant degree, the product of the specific cognitive constraints of the human social brain and the specific ecological constraints of the hunter-gatherer economy. The British anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed in the early 1990s that the size of the neocortex, the brain region associated with social cognition, scales with the typical social group size across primate species, and that the human neocortex predicts a stable social group size of approximately 150 people. The number now known as Dunbar's number. The band's size of 15 to 50 is smaller than Dunbar's number, which makes sense when you understand the relationship. The band is the small daily interaction group within a larger social network. The band was the group you lived with continuously, but it was embedded in a larger network of related and affiliated bands, the broader ethnic or linguistic group with whom you had regular contact, shared mating partners, exchanged goods and information, and cooperated in specific situations that required more people than the band alone could provide. This larger network, the extended social world beyond the immediate band, was maintained through the specific practices of interband visiting, the seasonal aggregations at locations where resources were abundant enough to support larger groups temporarily, the exchange of gifts and partners and stories that kept the connections between bands alive across the distances and the time gaps between contacts. The hunter-gatherer social world was not the isolated band-specific world that the small group size might imply. It was a networked world, connected across significant geographic areas through the social relationships that the mobile, wide-ranging hunter-gatherer lifestyle made both possible and necessary. The leadership of the band was one of the most important respects in which the pre-civilized world differed from what came after. There was no chief in the hereditary, institutionalized sense, no position of authority that passed from parent to child or that was maintained by force. The leadership of the hunter-gatherer band was what anthropologists call achieved status rather than ascribed status. The influence that a person had was the influence that their demonstrated abilities and their social intelligence had earned, and it lasted as long as those abilities and that intelligence continued to be demonstrated. The skilled hunter whose knowledge of the landscape and the animals had produced food for the band had influence, not because the band was required to follow him, but because the band's experience of his judgment had given them reasons to trust it. The experienced elder whose memory of past seasons and past decisions gave the band access to historical knowledge that no individual alive could replicate had influence, not because of any formal authority, but because the information she held was genuinely valuable, and the band knew it. The person who was consistently good at managing conflict, at finding the words and the approach that resolved tension before it became violence, had influence, because conflict in a small, interdependent group was genuinely dangerous, and the person who could prevent it was providing a genuine service. This was influence, not power. The distinction that the political anthropology of hunter-gatherer societies has worked hard to establish. The influential person in the band could not compel compliance. They could not imprison or execute or tax or redistribute resources through institutional authority. They could advise, propose, persuade, and demonstrate, and the band could follow or not follow based on its own assessment of the advice. The egalitarianism of the hunter-gatherer band, the specific, actively maintained resistance to individual domination that the comparative ethnography reveals as a near universal feature of band-level societies, was not the passive egalitarianism of people who hadn't thought of hierarchy. It was the active egalitarianism of people who understood the dangers of domination in a small, interdependent group, and who maintained their equality through the specific social practices of leveling, the mockery of pretension, the refusal to acknowledge claims of superiority, the sharing norms that prevented the accumulation of resources that could be converted into power. The anthropologist Christopher Bohm called this reverse dominance hierarchy, the phenomenon in which the typical primate tendency toward dominance hierarchies is inverted in human hunter-gatherer societies, with the group collectively managing the behavior of potentially dominant individuals through the social pressure of mockery, ostracism, and in extreme cases, expulsion. The dominant individual who pushed too hard was the person who found himself suddenly without the social support that the band's cooperation provided, and in the hunter-gatherer world, the person without social support was in genuine danger. Bohm's research suggests that this reverse dominance hierarchy was not a recent cultural development, but a long-standing feature of human social organization. That the egalitarianism of the hunter-gatherer band was the product of the same evolutionary process that produced the cognitive and social capacities that made human cooperation possible. The human brain that could plan and coordinate and communicate was also the brain that could recognize and resist domination, and both capacities evolved together in the same social context. Your band has 23 members today. 2 of the younger adults left last month to join another band, one following a partner, one following a disagreement with another member that had not been resolvable. 2 babies have been born in the past year. One of the oldest members, a woman who had seen perhaps 50 winters and whose knowledge of the medicinal plants of the region was irreplaceable, died 3 months ago of an infection that nothing in the band's medical knowledge could address. The loss of her knowledge was a real loss. The specific knowledge of which plants to combine for which conditions, acquired over decades of observation and practice, was gone with her, and the band knew it. The younger members, who had been learning from her, had absorbed some of what she knew, but not all of it, and the gaps would be felt in the coming seasons when the specific conditions her knowledge was needed for arose. This was the vulnerability of the band's knowledge system, the oral transmission of accumulated practical wisdom that had no backup, no written record, no institutional preservation. Every death was potentially a knowledge loss, and the knowledge losses accumulated over generations in ways that the band managed through the specific social practices of knowledge transmission. The stories, the demonstrations, the apprenticeships, the deliberate and repeated teaching of the knowledge that the community most valued. The social life of the band was not all survival and knowledge management. It was also, in the most immediately human sense, the ongoing social life of people who knew each other well and who spent most of their waking hours in each other's company. The conversation, the humor, the gossip, the romantic drama, the conflict and its resolution, the games, the music, the stories told around the fire in the evenings, all of this was present, and all of it mattered to the people, involved in exactly the way that the equivalent activities matter to the people engaged in them today. The specific form of the humor of a Pleistocene band is not recoverable from the archaeological record, but the capacity for humor, the cognitive and social functions of humor in human group life, is as ancient as the social brain that produced it, the joke that released the tension of a difficult day, the shared laughter that reinforced the social bond between people who needed to cooperate tomorrow as they had cooperated today, the specific comedy of the well-known personalities' predictable behavior. These were as present in the Pleistocene band as they are in the modern office, because they are products of the same social brain, operating in the same basic social situation. Chapter 2. The Food. How hunter-gatherers actually ate and why it was more complicated than you think. Let's solve the food problem. The food problem of the pre-civilized world was not the simple problem of go out and kill something that the popular image of the prehistoric hunter suggests. It was a sophisticated, knowledge-intensive, environmentally specific problem whose solution required the kind of detailed, locally specific knowledge that takes years to accumulate, and that was one of the most important things that the band's accumulated wisdom preserved and transmitted. The term hunter-gatherer is itself slightly misleading in its implied balance between the two activities, because in most environments that have been studied, the gathering significantly exceeded the hunting in terms of caloric contribution to the diet. The specific numbers vary dramatically by environment. The Arctic hunter-gatherers, who derived nearly all their calories from animal foods because the plant foods were simply not available, at their latitude are at one end of the spectrum, and the tropical and subtropical foragers, who derived the majority of their calories from plant foods, are at the other. But the average across environments that have been systematically studied suggests that plant foods typically contributed 60 to 80% of the calories, with animal foods contributing the remainder. This means that the person with the most important food-finding knowledge in the typical hunter-gatherer band was not the hunter. It was the person, typically a woman, in the gender division of labor that most hunter-gatherer societies maintained, who knew which plants in this specific landscape, at this specific time of year, in this specific weather pattern, were producing edible food, where to find them, how to process them to make them edible or to remove their toxins, and how to manage the harvest to preserve the resource for future use. The plant knowledge of the skilled forager was not the knowledge of a person who ate whatever looked edible and hoped for the best. It was the precise, tested, accumulated knowledge of a person who knew which berries in this region were safe and which were toxic, which root vegetables needed to be leached in water before eating to remove the compounds that would otherwise be poisonous, which plants produced their best food at which stage of growth, and which locations in the landscape were most likely to be productive at which times of year. This knowledge was acquired over a lifetime of experience and instruction. The child who accompanied the adults on foraging expeditions from early childhood, learning through observation and guided practice the specific knowledge of the local plant community that would take years to develop into the comprehensive expertise of the skilled adult forager. The 8-year-old who could not yet identify all the useful plants in the local landscape was a child still in the process of acquiring the knowledge that the adult's competence represented, and the adult's patience with the child's learning was the investment in the next generation's food security that the band's survival required. The hunting was not simpler. The tracking skills that effective hunting required, the ability to read the landscape for the specific signs that indicated the presence, the direction, the recency, and the condition of the specific animal being pursued, were skills of extraordinary complexity that took years to develop, and that the best hunters in any band represented as a form of expertise that genuinely impressed people outside the tradition when they encountered it. The tracking knowledge of the skilled hunter included the ability to read footprints in different substrates, the specific shape and depth of a track in soft mud versus dry sand, and what those differences indicated about the animal's weight, speed, and gait. The knowledge of how tracks aged in different weather conditions, how long ago a particular track was made, based on the way the edges had crumbled or the surface had dried. The knowledge of the animal's behavior, where it was likely to go, based on the time of day and the weather, and the season and the specific landscape, features that the animal's own habits and preferences made relevant. The tracking knowledge also included the synthesis of multiple simultaneous information sources: the track, the broken vegetation, the disturbed soil, the scat, the smell, the behavior of birds and other animals that indicated the presence of a predator or large herbivore in the area, the sounds of the landscape, and what their presence or absence indicated about what was moving through it. The skilled tracker was reading the landscape as a comprehensive information system, integrating dozens of data streams into a coherent picture of what had happened in this place and what was likely to be happening in the place toward which the tracks were leading. The persistence hunt, the specifically human hunting strategy that exploited the unique human capacity for sustained endurance running to run prey animals to exhaustion, was one of the more remarkable pre-civilized hunting techniques, and one that the comparative evidence suggests was used by hunter-gatherers in appropriate environments for tens of thousands of years before the development of more complex projectile weapons. The human being, who could run continuously for hours in the midday heat, maintaining a moderate pace that the prey animal could easily outrun in any single sprint but could not maintain across the hours of continuous pursuit, was exploiting the specific thermoregulatory advantage that the eccrine sweat gland system provided. The quadrupedal animals that the persistence hunter pursued, the antelope, the kudu, the various African ungulates that were the primary prey of the East African hunters who have been best studied, panted to cool themselves, and panting while running at the sustained pace required to stay ahead of the pursuing human was physiologically difficult. The animal that couldn't cool itself fast enough eventually overheated, slowed, and was caught by the human who had been running at a pace below his maximum for hours, while the animal had been running near its maximum to stay ahead. The persistence hunt required the tracking knowledge to follow the prey across the landscape, the physiological capacity for sustained endurance running, the experience to know when the prey was approaching exhaustion, and the patience to maintain the pursuit across the hours that the technique required. It was a specifically human hunting method. No other animal hunts this way, because no other animal has the combination of endurance, thermoregulation, and cognitive capacity for sustained goal-directed pursuit that the technique requires. And it was one of the ways that Homo sapiens exploited its specific biological advantages in the pre-weapon hunting economy. The weapons that supplemented and eventually largely replaced the persistence hunt developed over the long span of the Stone Age with a gradual complexity that the archaeological record traces. The simple wooden spear, a pointed stick essentially the simplest possible projectile technology, was in use by our ancestors long before anatomically modern humans appeared. The hafted spear with a stone tip, a composite tool requiring the matching of a stone point to a wooden shaft, and the binding of the two with plant fiber or sinew, represented a significant technological advance whose complexity of manufacture reflected the specific cognitive capacities that the human lineage had developed. The atlatl, the spear thrower, the device that extended the effective throwing arm of the spear caster and significantly increased the velocity and range of the thrown spear, was a later development, one that appears in the archaeological record approximately 30,000 years ago, and that represented a genuine leap in hunting effectiveness. the bow and arrow, which came later still, approximately 70,000 years ago in Africa, according to the most recent evidence, though widespread adoption appears much later, was another significant technological advance, whose greater range and rate of fire changed the calculus of the hunt in ways that the archaeological record of prey species abundances begins to reflect. The fishing technology of coastal and riverine hunter-gatherers added another dimension to the food-finding repertoire that the aquatic environments made available. The shell middens, the massive accumulations of shellfish shells that the coastal foragers of the pre-civilized world left at their campsites, some of them meters deep and dating back tens of thousands of years, are the visible evidence of the intensive shellfish harvesting that provided a reliable, storable, predictable protein source to the groups that had access to productive coastal environments. The fish traps, the woven nets, the gorge hooks of bone that appear in the archaeological record of river and lake adjacent populations. These were the fishing technology whose effectiveness is reflected in the fishbone accumulations at archaeological sites that tell the isotopic story of the diet. The diet that all this food-finding effort produced was, by modern nutritional standards, genuinely excellent in several important respects. The variety of plant foods consumed by the skilled forager was extraordinary by the standards of the agricultural diet that replaced it. The estimates of the number of plant species consumed by various hunter-gatherer groups range from dozens to several hundred, compared to the handful of staple crops that the agricultural diet organized itself around. The diversity of this plant-based diet provided a corresponding nutritional diversity that the specialized agricultural diet lacked. A wider range of vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, and fiber types that the modern nutritional research is increasingly recognizing as important for the various dimensions of metabolic and immune health. The animal foods of the hunter-gatherer diet were also nutritionally different from the animal foods of the agricultural and modern dietary traditions. The wild animals consumed were leaner than the domesticated animals of the agricultural world, less saturated fat, more omega-3 fatty acids from the foraging diet that the wild animal had eaten. A fatty acid profile that the modern nutritional research identifies as more consistent with good cardiovascular health than the profile of the grain-fed domesticated animals that became the standard after agriculture. Chapter 3: The Shelter, where hunter-gatherers slept, and the specific genius of mobile architecture. You need somewhere to sleep. The shelter of the pre-civilized world was not the cave of popular imagination, or rather, it was sometimes the cave, the geological feature that provided natural shelter and that human populations used when it was conveniently located relative to the food resources they needed to access. But the cave was the exception rather than the rule, and the characteristic shelter of the mobile hunter-gatherer was something considerably more interesting than a hole in a rock. The characteristic shelter was whatever the local materials permitted, constructed with the specific knowledge of the local environment that the band had accumulated, designed for the specific combination of portability, quick construction, and adequate protection from the elements that the mobile lifestyle required. Not permanent and not impressive by the standards of later architecture, but functional, comfortable, and ingeniously adapted to the specific challenges of the specific environment. The simple lean-to, branches against a frame, covered with bark or leaves or grass or hides, depending on what was available, was one of the most basic forms, adequate for temporary camps in mild weather, and constructed in an hour from the materials immediately at hand. The more elaborate dome structure, the framework of bent branches covered with whatever insulating material the environment provided, was the more developed form, capable of providing genuine protection from rain and cold, and capable of being constructed in a few hours by experienced builders with the right materials. The hide-covered structures of the open grassland environments, the areas where wood was scarce, but the large animals whose hides provided excellent insulating material were abundant, were the specific adaptation of the savanna grassland hunter-gatherer to an environment that didn't provide the forest's convenient supply of branches and leaves. The specific engineering of the hide-covered structure, the framework of bones, or the limited available wood, the carefully prepared hides that covered it, the specific techniques of joining and sealing that kept the wind out, was the technology of people who had been solving this particular shelter problem for generations and who had developed, through that accumulated experience, the solutions that the environment specifically permitted. The mammoth bone structures of Ice Age Europe are among the most extraordinary examples of pre-civilized shelter construction. The massive, carefully arranged piles of mammoth bones that formed the structural framework of shelters in the Ukrainian steppe, where wood was essentially unavailable, and the bones of the large animals that the inhabitants hunted provided the structural material that the environment otherwise denied. The specific arrangement of these bone structures, documented at multiple sites across the Eastern European plain, reflects a genuine architectural intelligence, the problem-solving of people who needed shelter in a specific environment and who used what the environment provided with a creativity that the subsequent architecture of civilization has been pleased to forget. The fire inside the shelter was the heating system, and the management of the fire inside an enclosed shelter was a practical skill with safety implications that the experienced shelter builder addressed through the design of the structure. The smoke hole, the opening at the top or side of the shelter that allowed the smoke to escape while retaining the heat, was the essential architectural feature of the enclosed heated shelter, and its design involved the specific understanding of the airflow dynamics that determined whether the smoke rose and escaped or pooled and suffocated. The sleeping arrangements within the shelter were organized around warmth and social relationship in the ways we have discussed in other contexts. The bodies pressed together for warmth, the fire between the sleepers and the cold of the outside world, the specific social geography of who slept near whom, reflecting the social relationships and the thermal requirements of the group simultaneously. The sleeping in the shared shelter was not the privacy-organized sleeping of the modern world. It was the communal sleeping of people for whom warmth and safety required proximity, and for whom proximity was the natural condition of the band's daily life. The location of the camp was itself a decision requiring the integrated knowledge of the landscape that the experienced band members possessed, the proximity to water, the access to the food resources of the season, the specific topographic features that provided protection from wind and from the approach of predators, the specific signs that indicated whether this location had been used recently by other human groups or by the large carnivores that were the band's primary non-human threats. The choice of campsite was not the casual decision of people who would set up anywhere convenient. It was the considered judgment of people for whom the wrong campsite could mean a night of genuine danger. And the knowledge of what made a campsite good or bad was one of the practical knowledges that the band's accumulated experience had refined. The mobility of the band, the regular movement from campsite to campsite that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle required, was calibrated to the food resources of the landscape in the specific seasonally organized way that the landscape's ecology determined. The band that understood its territory's seasonal productivity, which locations were productive in which seasons, which resources required the band to be in which places at which times, was a band that could plan its movements in advance in ways that maximized food security across the year's variation. The territory of the hunter-gatherer band was not the vast, undefined wilderness that the popular image suggests. It was a known landscape, known in the specific, intimate, individually detailed way that people who have walked every part of it repeatedly throughout their lives know it. Every water source, every reliable plant food location, every topographic feature, every significant landmark, these were known, named, and integrated into the band's understanding of the landscape in ways that the modern person's relationship with their GPS-dependent navigation of an urban environment barely begins to approximate. Chapter 4. The knowledge. The extraordinary cognitive achievement of the hunter-gatherer mind. You know things, not the things that the modern educational system has decided are worth knowing, not the algebraic formulas and the historical dates and the grammatical rules that the school curriculum packages into the specific knowledge categories that institutional education values. You know different things, older things, things whose practical value is so immediate and so direct that the question of why you would bother knowing them never arises, because the answer is self-evident. You know them because your life depends on them. You know the name and the properties of every plant within 2 days' walk of your current camp. Not in the botanical Latin of the Linnaean classification system, in the specific, locally meaningful names that your language has given them, names that often encode information about the plant's properties and uses directly. The plant whose name translates roughly as the one that stops bleeding is the plant you reach for when someone is cut. The plant whose name means makes you sleep is used carefully and sparingly for the specific purposes that the band's medical tradition has identified. The plant whose name means kills the stomach worms is deployed when the specific symptoms that indicate intestinal parasites appear in a band member. This pharmacological knowledge, the accumulated, tested, transmitted understanding of the medicinal properties of the local plant community, was one of the most important bodies of knowledge that the hunter-gatherer band maintained, and it was knowledge that the pharmaceutical industry of the 20th and 21st centuries has repeatedly found to be pointing toward real biological activity. The ethnobotanical research that has systematically investigated the medicinal plant traditions of hunter-gatherer and traditional agricultural societies has found, with remarkable consistency, that the plants identified by traditional knowledge as medicinally useful contain active compounds that the laboratory analysis confirms have the specific biological activities that the traditional use implied. This is not mystical coincidence. It is the predictable result of thousands of years of empirical testing, the accumulated experience of populations who tried plants, observed outcomes, kept the practices that produced good outcomes, and abandoned the practices that didn't. The methodology was not the controlled clinical trial of modern medicine, but it was genuine empirical investigation, operating over timescales that the modern clinical trial cannot approach, producing knowledge whose accuracy the laboratory is now confirming. The true astronomical knowledge of the pre-civilized hunter-gatherer was another dimension of the extraordinary cognitive achievement that the modern imagination tends to undervalue. The night sky without light pollution, the sky that every pre-civilized human saw every clear night, in a darkness that the modern urban person almost never experiences, was a comprehensive, detailed, continuously changing display of information about time, season, direction, and the rhythms of the natural world. The stars were not decoration. They were a calendar, a compass, and a predictive system whose patterns the experienced observer could read with the precision that years of close attention produced. The rising and setting of specific star groups, the Pleiades, Orion, the Southern Cross in the Southern Hemisphere, marked the seasons with a reliability that the landscape's biological changes confirmed. When this star cluster rises at sunset, the rains are coming. When that star sets before dawn, the time for the specific migration of the animals you hunt is approaching. The ability to navigate by the stars was the hunter-gatherer's GPS, the specific knowledge of which stars to follow and in which direction, at which time of night, and which season, to travel reliably between known locations across distances that the landscape's terrain made otherwise difficult to orient in. The Polynesian navigators who crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean using star knowledge, wave patterns, and the behavior of birds are the most famous example of this navigational intelligence. But the same basic navigational knowledge, adapted to the specific environment and the specific stars visible from it, was a feature of mobile hunter-gatherer life across every inhabited continent. The ecological knowledge that the skilled hunter-gatherer possessed was a systems-level understanding of the local environment that the modern ecology as a scientific discipline is still working to formalize. The understanding of the relationships between species, which plants the specific animals ate, which animals controlled, which pest populations, which environmental changes produced which ecological cascades, was the applied ecology of people who depended on the functioning of the local ecosystem for their survival, and who had been observing it with the attention that dependence produces for generations. The knowledge of animal behavior was particularly sophisticated and particularly practically important. The hunter who understood the daily rhythms of the specific prey species, where it slept, where it fed, what time of day it moved between these locations, what stimuli caused it to flee, and what distance it required before it felt safe enough to settle again, was a hunter who could position himself in the right place at the right time to make the kill that the less knowledgeable hunter would attempt unsuccessfully and noisily, alerting every animal in the area and spending a day's energy for nothing. The understanding of predator behavior was equally important for safety. The knowledge of where lions and leopards and hyenas were most likely to be at which times of day, what signs indicated their recent or current presence in an area, how to read the alarm calls of birds and other animals that indicated the presence of a predator. This was survival knowledge in the most direct sense, and the failure to possess it or to act on it was failure with immediate physical consequences. The weather knowledge of the experienced hunter-gatherer was the meteorological expertise of a person who had been observing the local weather patterns from the specific location of their territory for years, who had correlated the specific cloud formations and wind patterns and atmospheric changes with the weather that followed, and who could predict, not with the precision of the modern meteorological service, but with the practical accuracy of someone who had been right enough times to have learned what the reliable indicators were. Whether a storm was coming, how soon and how severe. This predictive knowledge was not infallible, and the weather's unpredictability was a real and significant risk in the pre-civilized world. But the accumulated local knowledge of the experienced band member provided a meaningful advantage over the naive observer in assessing what the weather was likely to do. And this advantage was real enough to be one of the specific knowledges that the older members of the band were most valued for. The elder whose weather predictions had been consistently reliable over decades of observation had a specific, practically grounded authority on this question that the younger members respected because they had seen the predictions validated. The cognitive architecture that produced and maintained this extraordinary body of practical knowledge was the same cognitive architecture that the modern human possesses. The same working memory, the same pattern recognition, the same capacity for abstraction and analogy, the same social intelligence that allows knowledge to be transmitted between individuals and across generations. What was different was the direction in which this cognitive architecture was pointed, the specific questions it was applied to, the specific domains where the investment of cognitive effort paid off in survival and reproduction. The pre-civilized human mind was not a simpler version of the modern mind. It was the same mind, applied to a different set of problems, and the sophistication of its solutions to those problems was the sophistication that the same cognitive capacities bring to any sufficiently complex and consequential set of questions. The memory systems that maintained the band's knowledge in the absence of writing were themselves a remarkable cognitive achievement. The oral tradition, the specific practices of encoding important information in forms that are memorable and transmissible, is a technology of mind whose sophistication the advent of writing has tended to obscure. The story that encodes information about the landscape, the song that preserves the seasonal calendar, the ritual that rehearses the knowledge whose forgetting would be costly. These were the memory technologies of the pre-literate world, and they were effective enough to maintain complex, accurate information across generations in ways that the occasional written tradition has simply replaced rather than improved. The Australian Aboriginal traditions of the songlines, the networks of song paths that encode geographic information about the landscape in musical form, providing the navigator with a mnemonic map of the country whose accuracy has been confirmed by modern geographic survey, are one of the most extensively documented examples of the oral tradition as information technology. The songlines maintained accurate, geographic information about the Australian landscape across tens of thousands of years, in the absence of any written or graphic record, through the specific cognitive technology of the musical narrative encoding that the tradition had developed. Chapter 5. The Health. What pre-civilized human health actually looked like. The popular image of pre-civilized human health is one of misery, the constant pain of untreated injury and illness, the ravages of infection and parasite, the short lifespan that the brutish pre-modern life produced. The reality is considerably more nuanced, and in some specific respects, considerably more favorable than the popular image suggests. Let's start with what was genuinely bad, because there was genuinely bad. The injuries of the hunter-gatherer life were serious and frequently untreatable by anything in the band's medical repertoire. The broken bone that healed badly, the infected wound that progressed to sepsis, the injury from a fall, or from the dangerous work of killing large animals at close range. These were real, and they killed people at ages that the modern world would consider entirely premature. The skeletal record of pre-agricultural human populations shows the specific signs of a physically demanding life: the arthritis, the healed fractures, the muscle attachment sites, enlarged by years of sustained physical labor, the dental wear that the specific diet and the specific food preparation practices produced. The infectious disease picture was also mixed. The specific pattern of infectious disease in small mobile bands was different from the infectious disease pattern of the agricultural village and the city that came after, and the difference cuts in both directions. The mobile band that covered a large territory was less likely to accumulate the environmental pathogens, the contaminated water sources, the fecal-oral disease vectors, the rodent-borne pathogens that the settled villages, permanent habitation of a single location, produced. The small group size meant that crowd diseases, the specific infectious diseases that require a continuous supply of susceptible individuals to maintain transmission, and that became endemic only with the population densities that agriculture produced, could not maintain themselves in the band population, burning through the available, susceptible individuals and then disappearing until reintroduction from outside. The specific crowd diseases that civilization introduced and that became the major killers of the historical period, smallpox, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, were essentially absent from the pre-agricultural world. Not because pre-agricultural humans had better immune systems, but because the epidemiological conditions for their persistence, the population densities, and the domestic animal populations that served as reservoir hosts were absent. The hunter-gatherer who never encountered smallpox was not immune to it. The devastating epidemics that swept through indigenous populations at first contact with disease-carrying Europeans demonstrated what happened when populations without prior exposure encountered these pathogens. But in the pre-contact world, the absence of the epidemiological conditions meant the absence of the epidemic diseases. The parasitic disease burden was significant in tropical environments. The malaria, the intestinal parasites, the various vector-borne diseases that the tropical environment hosted were real and debilitating features of tropical hunter-gatherer health. The skeletal record shows the signs of childhood stress, the growth interruptions, the enamel defects, the Harris lines in the bone that indicate periods of nutritional stress or illness during development that infectious and parasitic disease produced. The dental health of pre-agricultural populations was, by modern standards, surprisingly good in some respects and problematic in others. The absence of the refined carbohydrates, the sugar, the white flour that the modern diet provides in abundance meant that the specific dental caries that these carbohydrates produce were relatively rare in pre-agricultural populations. The hunter-gatherer tooth that has been examined by dental anthropologists shows less cavity damage than the agricultural tooth because the diet that the hunter-gatherer ate was less cariogenic, less prone to producing the acidic conditions in the mouth that the cavity-causing bacteria exploit. The wear, however, was dramatic. The hunter-gatherer diet required more chewing, tougher plant foods, raw or simply cooked animal foods, the occasional grit in the food that the processing on stone tools introduced than the softer, more processed foods of the agricultural and modern diet, and the molars of the pre-agricultural humans show the specific wear pattern of a lifetime of extensive chewing. The wear exposed the dentine beneath the enamel, and in some cases reached the pulp chamber, producing the tooth pain that the band's medical tradition addressed with the available analgesics, and that the affected individual lived with as a chronic feature of middle and later life. The life expectancy picture requires careful interpretation because the raw numbers, the average life expectancy at birth of approximately 30 to 35 years that the skeletal record of pre-agricultural populations produces, are misleading if read as the lifespan that the average person survived to. The low average life expectancy at birth is dominated by the very high infant and child mortality of the pre-modern world. The deaths in the first 5 years of life, that the infectious diseases, and the nutritional deficiencies, and the accidents of the pre-modern childhood, produced in enormous numbers. The person who survived childhood in the pre-agricultural world had a life expectancy that looks considerably more similar to the modern world's. The hunter-gatherer who made it to adulthood, who survived the dangerous first decade that killed so many of their contemporaries, could reasonably expect to live into their 40s, 50s, or occasionally beyond, with the specific variation that the environment, the season, the luck, and the individual's health history produced. The ethnographic record of recent hunter-gatherer societies confirms this picture. The Kung San of the Kalahari, the most intensively studied recent hunter-gatherer population, had significant numbers of individuals in their 60s and beyond. A demographic profile that is inconsistent with the nasty, brutish, and short characterization. If short is understood to mean that nobody lived past 40, the elders of the Kung Band were not rare curiosities. They were valued members of the community whose age-accumulated knowledge was one of the band's most important resources, and their existence in significant numbers is documented in the demographic surveys that the anthropologists who studied the Kung conducted. The physical fitness of the hunter-gatherer was, by modern standards, extraordinary. Not the extreme specialized fitness of the competitive athlete, but the comprehensive, functional fitness of a body that engaged in sustained physical activity every day across a full range of human movement. The walking, the running, the climbing, the lifting, the carrying. The specific physical demands of the hunter-gatherer's daily work produced bodies of genuine physical capability, whose skeletal remains show the muscle attachment sites, enlarged by decades of regular use, that the sedentary modern body's skeleton doesn't match. The specific comparison of pre-agricultural and early agricultural skeletal populations is one of the more dramatic findings of the bioarchaeology of the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, and the findings consistently challenge the narrative of agricultural progress. The early agricultural populations show significantly worse skeletal health than the preceding hunter-gatherer populations, more evidence of nutritional deficiency, more infectious disease, more dental caries, shorter average stature. The biological signatures of a transition to a diet that was more productive in calories but less diverse in nutrition, and to living conditions that were more disease-prone. This is the specific paradox of the Neolithic transition that the archaeologist Mark Nathan Cohen documented in the 1970s, and that subsequent research has confirmed. The transition to agriculture made populations larger and more sedentary, but it made the individuals within those populations biologically worse off in measurable ways. The civilization that agriculture enabled was built, at least in part, on the biological costs that the agricultural population paid in nutrition and disease, that the hunter-gatherer population had not paid to the same degree. The mental health of the pre-civilized hunter-gatherer is less directly accessible from the archaeological record, but the comparative evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies and the evolutionary psychology perspective on the match between the human mind's design and the environment for which it was designed suggests some interesting considerations. The specific psychological stressors of the modern world, the social comparison enabled by the large, anonymous societies in which most modern humans live, the specific anxieties of complex bureaucratic and economic systems, the existential challenges of meaning-making in a world where the traditional frameworks have been disrupted, were not features of the hunter-gatherer's psychological environment. The stressors of the pre-civilized world were different. The physical danger, the uncertainty of food supply, the grief of loss in a world where loss was frequent and medical intervention was limited. The social support available in the band was also different from the social support available in most modern contexts, more immediate, more comprehensive, more embedded in the daily life of the community in ways that the isolation of the modern individual's social experience doesn't replicate. The person in the pre-civilized band who was grieving or frightened or struggling was surrounded by people who knew them intimately and who had both the social obligation and the practical motivation to provide support. Chapter 6. The Spiritual Life. What the evidence suggests about pre-civilized belief and ritual. The ochre was intentional. This is the thing that the archaeological evidence keeps telling us, with increasing insistence and increasing specificity about the minds of the people who lived before civilization. They were not simply surviving. They were also doing something else. Something that the physical evidence of their camps and their graves and their decorated objects reveals as a dimension of human life that predates civilization by hundreds of thousands of years, and that cannot be explained purely in terms of the survival value it provided. The ochre, the iron oxide mineral that produces the red and yellow pigments that have been found at human archaeological sites since at least 160,000 years ago, was being collected, processed, and used long before it was needed for any purely functional purpose that we have been able to identify. The ochre-stained grinding stones at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, dated to approximately 164,000 years ago, are evidence of people who were deliberately producing red pigment for some purpose, decorating their bodies, decorating objects, marking locations in the landscape, at a time when the behavioral modernity that the ochre implies was not supposed to have developed yet. The use of ochre for body decoration. The painting of the skin with the red pigment that the processed ochre produced is documented in numerous recent hunter-gatherer societies across Africa, Australia, and the Americas, and the function of the body decoration varies by context. It marks identity, marks ritual status, marks the transition from one social category to another, marks the individual as part of the group's collective visual vocabulary. The ochre-painted body was not merely a decorated body. It was a body communicating something to the social group that the undecorated body was not communicating. The grave goods, the objects, placed with the dead in the specific, intentional, curated way that the archaeological evidence reveals, are among the most powerful indicators of the spiritual life of pre-civilized humans, because the deliberate placement of objects with the dead is almost universally interpreted as evidence of belief in some form of continued existence after death. The person who places a tool or a flower or a shell ornament with a body is a person who is acting on the belief, or at least the hope, that the dead person will need or appreciate these things in whatever state of existence follows death. The Shanidar cave burials in Iraq, the Neanderthal burials that were initially interpreted as containing flower offerings, and that have been the subject of significant subsequent debate about whether the pollen found in the sediments was deliberately placed or naturally deposited, exemplify both the evidence for and the interpretive difficulties of inferring spiritual life from the archaeological record. Whether the flowers were intentional or not, the deliberate burial of the dead, the treatment of the body as deserving specific, careful disposal rather than abandonment, is itself evidence of a relationship with death that is not purely functional. The anatomically modern human burials of the Upper Paleolithic period, the approximately 40,000-year-old burials that appear with increasing frequency and elaboration in the European record, are unambiguous in their intentionality. The Sungir burials in Russia dated to approximately 34,000 years ago, contain individuals buried with extraordinary quantities of mammoth ivory beads, thousands of them, sewn into the clothing that the bead distribution reveals the body to have been wearing, along with ivory lances, carved figures, and the specific elaborate treatment of the dead that represents a significant investment of time and labor by the living. The person buried at Sungar with thousands of ivory beads was being sent into death by a community that had invested considerable effort in this specific farewell. The beads themselves, each one requiring approximately an hour of skilled labor to produce from mammoth ivory, represent thousands of person-hours of work dedicated to the burial of a single individual. This is not the behavior of a community focused purely on immediate survival. It is the behavior of a community that believed the investment was worthwhile, for reasons that the physical survival calculus alone cannot explain. The ritual behavior that the archaeological record reveals in the pre-civilized period is not limited to the treatment of the dead. The specific arrangements of objects that appear at sites across the span of the Stone Age, the intentional placement of specific materials in specific configurations that the natural processes of site formation cannot explain, are evidence of ritual activity in the living community whose specific meaning is not recoverable, but whose intentionality is clear. The animal representations that appear in pre-civilized contexts, the carved animal figurines, the engraved animal images on bone and stone, the animal images that appear in the cave art, suggest a relationship with the animal world that went beyond the purely practical. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, the approximately 40,000-year-old carved figure combining a human body with a lion's head, produced from mammoth ivory, with the specific skill and sustained effort of a craftsperson who knew exactly what they were making, is one of the most extraordinary artifacts of pre-civilized human creativity, and one of the most direct indicators of a mythological imagination that could conceive of the combination of human and animal in a single being. The specific content of pre-civilized spiritual belief is not recoverable with confidence. The archaeological evidence tells us that spiritual belief existed, that the people of the pre-civilized world had some framework for understanding death and the dead, some relationship with the supernatural that expressed itself in ritual behavior, some mythological imagination that produced the hybrid figures and the decorated objects, and the careful, elaborated treatment of the dead. It does not tell us what specific cosmology organized these practices, what specific beings inhabited the supernatural world as they understood it, or what specific transactions between the human and the supernatural their rituals were designed to accomplish. The comparative evidence from recent hunter-gatherer societies, the shamanic traditions, the animist cosmologies, the specific ritual practices that anthropologists have documented across the full range of hunter-gatherer cultures, provides a suggestive but not definitive picture of what pre-civilized spiritual life might have looked like in its general character. The specific diversity of these traditions, the enormous variation in cosmology and ritual practice across the world's hunter-gatherer cultures, is itself an important piece of evidence. There was no single pre-civilized religion, any more than there is a single modern religion, and the specific content of the spiritual life was as locally varied as the specific content of the ecological knowledge. The shamanic complex, the widespread presence across hunter-gatherer cultures of the specialist practitioner who mediates between the human community and the supernatural world, who enters altered states of consciousness through specific techniques, and who uses the access that this altered state provides to address the community's concerns about health, weather, animals, and the various dimensions of life that the supernatural world was understood to influence, is one of the most consistently documented features of hunter-gatherer spiritual life. The specific techniques of the shamanic trance, the rhythmic drumming, the specific breathing techniques, the use of psychoactive plants where they were available and where the tradition had incorporated them, are documented across hunter-gatherer cultures with sufficient consistency to suggest that the shamanic complex is genuinely ancient, a feature of the spiritual life that predates the divergence of the specific cultures in which it appears. the cave art that appears in the European record, beginning approximately 40,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier in other regions, with the Sulawesi cave art of Indonesia, now dated to at least 45,000 years ago, has been interpreted by some researchers as the specific product of the shamanic trance experience. The visual representations of the hallucinations produced by the altered state of consciousness made on the cave walls that the shaman experienced as the membrane between the human world and the supernatural world that lay behind them. This interpretation, developed by the archaeologist David Lewis Williams from his analysis of both the cave art and the neuropsychological evidence about the specific visual patterns that altered states of consciousness produce, is contested by other researchers who prefer interpretations that emphasize the social and communicative functions of the art over the shamanic neurological ones. The debate is productive because it forces the specific engagement with the evidence that the most important questions in any field require, and because the cave art is extraordinary enough to warrant the sustained analytical attention that the debate reflects. Chapter 7. The Art, the extraordinary creative explosion of the Upper Paleolithic. You are standing in a cave, not the simple, dark, smelly hole in the ground that the word cave might initially suggest, a deep, complex, geometrically intricate cave system, the kind of limestone cave that the karst landscape of southwestern France and northern Spain, or the limestone country of Sulawesi in Indonesia, or the rock shelters of southern Africa produce in remarkable profusion. You are standing in the darkness that is absolute in the way that only underground darkness can be. The darkness in which you cannot see your hand in front of your face, and in which the absence of any light is so complete that the visual system, denied any input, begins to generate its own. You are holding a lamp, a shallow stone dish, or a folded piece of bark, or a shell, some container that holds the animal fat that is the fuel of the light, with a wick of moss or fiber that the flame catches and maintains. The light it produces is small, warm, and flickering, the specific quality of fatty animal fuel fire that the ethnographic and experimental archaeology of cave lighting has characterized. And in the darkness of the cave, this small light illuminates a circle of perhaps a meter or two of the cave wall, while leaving everything beyond in the shadow that the lamp's boundary marks. You hold the lamp up to the cave wall, and there, in the light of the animal fat lamp, you see what the people who came here before you made. The bison is running. Not literally running, it is painted on the limestone wall, in the ochre and manganese, dioxide and charcoal that the artists ground and mixed and applied with their fingers, and with pads, and with the specific blowing technique that the spray-painted hand stencils demonstrate. But the artist who painted it understood the animal's movement with the specific intimacy of a person who had watched bison move for a lifetime. And the lines that define the animal's body capture the specific tension of the muscular forequarters and the specific momentum of the running gait with an accuracy that the modern observer, the observer who has seen bison in motion, who has the visual experience to assess the fidelity of the representation, recognizes as genuinely skilled. The cave art of the Upper Paleolithic, the paintings and engravings and relief carvings that appear in the deep caves of southwestern France and northern Spain beginning approximately 40,000 years ago, and that the Chauvet Cave, the Lascaux Cave, the Altamira Cave, the Font de Gaume Cave, and dozens of other sites have preserved with the specific protectiveness of the sealed, climate-stable deep cave environment, is among the most extraordinary artistic achievements in human history. And it is extraordinary in specific ways that the casual description cave paintings fails to capture. The first extraordinary thing is the quality, the animal representations of the best cave art, the horses of Chauvet, the bison of Altamira, the aurochs and mammoths and rhinoceroses that populate the walls of the best preserved sites are not primitive, tentative, developmental versions of artistic representation. They are accomplished, confident, technically sophisticated works produced by people who had mastered the specific challenges of their medium. the uneven surface of the cave wall, the flickering light of the lamp, the pigments that had to be mixed to the right consistency and applied with the right technique, and who were using that mastery to achieve specific visual effects with an intentionality that the results confirm. The use of the cave wall's natural contours to enhance the representation, the protruding rock that becomes the bison's shoulder, the depression that suggests the hollow of a horse's back, the crack in the limestone that becomes the line of an animal's spine, is one of the techniques that the cave artists used with a sophistication that the modern observer recognizes as not accidental. The artist who chose to place this particular bison at this particular location on this particular wall, where the natural relief of the limestone enhanced the three-dimensionality of the painted animal, was making an artistic decision whose effect is visible and whose intentionality is clear. The second extraordinary thing is the age. The Chauvet Cave in the Ardèche region of southern France contains paintings that have been reliably dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, making them among the oldest figurative art in the European record. And the quality of the Chauvet paintings is as high as anything produced in the much later Lascaux and Altamira caves. The artistic tradition that produced the Chauvet paintings was not a young, developing tradition, finding its feet. It was a mature tradition with established techniques and conventions that the Chauvet artists were working within and extending. This maturity of the earliest European cave art tradition implies that the tradition had been developing before Chauvet, that the 36,000-year-old paintings we can see were not the beginning, but a point in the middle of a tradition whose earlier phases have not been preserved, or have not yet been found, or were made on surfaces that the geological processes of the intervening millennia have not protected as the deep cave protected the Chauvet paintings. The Sulawesi discovery complicated the European-centric narrative of the origins of figurative art. The cave art of the Maros Pangkep karst region of South Sulawesi in Indonesia includes animal representations, the Sulawesi warty pig, and the Anoa, a dwarf buffalo, that have been dated using uranium-thorium dating of the calcium carbonate crusts that have formed over them to at least 45,500 years ago, making them older than the oldest securely dated European cave art. The hand stencils of Sulawesi have been dated to at least 39,900 years ago. The implication of the Sulawesi dating is significant. Figurative art was being made in Southeast Asia at approximately the same time as in Europe, by people who had no connection to the European tradition. Either the capacity for figurative art was independently developed in multiple locations at approximately the same time, which would require an explanation for why the same innovation appeared simultaneously in different parts of the world. Or the capacity for figurative art was already present in the populations that left Africa approximately 70,000 years ago, and was brought with them to both Europe and Southeast Asia, expressing itself in the cave art traditions of both regions when the specific conditions for its expression were met. The second hypothesis, that the cognitive capacity for symbolic representation was present in the African population before the out-of-Africa migration, is supported by the evidence for symbolic behavior in Africa that predates the migration. The ochre use, the shell beads, the engraved geometric patterns on ochre that the Blombos Cave in South Africa has produced, dated to approximately 75,000 years ago. The Blombos engravings, abstract geometric patterns deliberately incised on pieces of ochre, are not figurative art, but they are clear evidence of symbolic behavior. The deliberate creation of marks that communicate meaning through their form rather than through any inherent physical property of the material. The music that the cave art's makers produced is less well preserved than the visual art, but not absent from the archaeological record. The bone flutes of the European Upper Paleolithic, the fragments of bird bone and mammoth ivory that have been shaped into functional flutes, whose tone holes are spaced in ways that produce specific musical scales, are dated to approximately 40,000 years ago in the same archaeological contexts that produced the earliest European cave art. The flute from the Hole of Fels cave in Germany, made from a vulture's wing bone with 5 carefully spaced finger holes, can be played by modern musicians and produces a sound that is, there is no other word for it, music. The specific scales that the Paleolithic flutes produce, and the musical traditions that the ethnographic record of recent hunter-gatherer societies documents, suggest that music was as comprehensively present in the pre-civilized world as it is in the modern one, organized differently, expressed through different instruments and different social contexts, but serving the same fundamental human functions of emotional expression, social bonding, the marking of ritual occasions, and the specific pleasure of organized sound, the decoration of objects, the personal ornaments of shell and bone and tooth, and carved ivory that appear in the Upper Paleolithic record, extended the visual culture of the cave artists into the daily portable dimension of personal adornment. The shell beads of School Cave in Israel, dated to approximately 100,000 years ago, are among the oldest known personal ornaments anywhere in the world, and their age, 60,000 years before the European cave art, demonstrates that the human impulse toward self-decoration and the communication of identity through visible objects was not a product of the specific creative explosion of the European Upper Paleolithic, but a much older feature of the behaviorally modern human mind. The specific information that personal ornaments communicate, the identity, the social status, the group membership, the specific life history events that the specific ornaments mark, was as real and as important in the pre-civilized world as the information that clothing and jewelry and tattooing and hairstyle communicate in the modern world. The person who wore specific shell beads that were available only from specific coastal locations, hundreds of miles from the inland site where the beads were found, was wearing an object that communicated specific information about their connections, their travels, and their social networks to every member of their community who understood the regional geography of shell availability. Chapter 8. The Language: How Pre-Civilized Humans Communicated and What Their Languages Were Like. Words are older than civilization, much older. The capacity for language, the specific cognitive and anatomical architecture that allows humans to produce and comprehend the arbitrary, combinatorially infinite, grammatically structured communication system that distinguishes human language from every other animal communication system, is one of the defining features of the human lineage, and it predates civilization by a margin that makes the civilized period look like a recent footnote to the linguistic story. The specific timeline of language's evolution is one of the most contested questions in the study of human origins, partly because language leaves almost no direct archaeological trace. The sounds that the pre-civilized human produced and the grammar that organized them were gone the moment they were spoken, preserved in no medium that the geological record could maintain. What the record does preserve are the indirect indicators, the anatomical features that the modern vocal tract requires for the production of speech, the brain structures associated with language processing, and the behavioral evidence for the symbolic cognition that complex language requires. The anatomical evidence for modern speech production capability, the descended larynx, the specific configuration of the hyoid bone that supports the tongue's complex movements in speech, the specific shape of the vocal tract that allows the production of the full range of vowel sounds, appears in the fossil record of the human lineage at roughly the same time as the anatomically modern skull, approximately 300,000 years ago. This doesn't prove that language was fully developed at this date. The relationship between anatomy and behavior is never simple, but it establishes that the physical infrastructure for modern speech production was in place from early in the history of our species. The Neanderthals had the hyoid bone in the modern human configuration, a finding from the Kabara cave Neanderthal, whose hyoid is the best preserved Neanderthal hyoid in the fossil record, suggesting that they too had the anatomical capacity for speech production. Whether they had the full cognitive infrastructure for language, the grammar, the recursion, The semantic complexity of modern human language is still debated, but the anatomical evidence suggests that the capacity for at least some form of complex vocal communication predates the divergence of modern humans and Neanderthals approximately 600,000 years ago. The languages of the pre-civilized world were fully modern languages. This is a critical point that the popular imagination tends to misunderstand. The earliest modern humans did not speak a simple, primitive proto-language that gradually became more complex over the millennia until it reached the sophistication of modern tongues. They spoke fully developed human languages with the full grammatical complexity, the full phonological range, the full semantic richness of any language spoken today. We know this because the languages spoken by the longest isolated hunter-gatherer populations that have been studied, the languages of the Aboriginal Australians, of the Andaman Islanders, of the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, are not simpler than the languages of the world's civilizational centers. If anything, they are more complex in certain grammatical dimensions, the elaborate case systems, the complex verbal morphology, the fine-grained distinctions that the grammar encodes, than the languages of the major civilizational traditions. The Khoisan languages, specifically, are the most phonologically complex languages known. The click consonants that distinguish them from most of the world's other languages represent a phonological elaboration that required generations of use and transmission to develop, and that is as far from primitive as anything in the world's linguistic inventory. The languages of the Australian Aboriginal peoples encode information about direction, relationship, and environmental features with a grammatical specificity that European languages manage only through elaborate circumlocutions. The diversity of pre-civilized language was also extraordinary. The linguistic diversity of the pre-agricultural world, the number of distinct, mutually unintelligible languages that the world's hunter-gatherer populations spoke, was significantly greater than the linguistic diversity of the modern world, where the spread of a small number of dominant languages through colonization, migration, and cultural assimilation has reduced the total number of the world's languages from an estimated 10,000 or more at the time of first European contact with the Americas and Australia to approximately 7,000 today, with the majority of those 7,000 spoken by very small numbers of people and expected to disappear within the next century or two. The Australian continent alone, at the time of European contact, had approximately 250 distinct language groups, 250 mutually unintelligible languages spoken by a total population of perhaps 300,000 to 750,000 people. The linguistic diversity per capita of the pre-contact Australian population was extraordinary, a reflection of the long period of isolation and the specific social dynamics of the hunter-gatherer world, in which small groups maintained their distinct identities and distinct languages across the generations with the specific stability that the band's social structure provided. The multilingualism that this linguistic diversity required was a standard feature of the pre-civilized world that the monolingual modern Westerner finds surprising. The hunter-gatherer, who lived at the boundary between two language groups, who traded and intermarried with members of neighboring groups whose language was different from their own, was typically multilingual as a practical necessity. The ethnographic record of recent hunter-gatherer societies consistently documents widespread multilingualism, with individuals routinely speaking 3 or 4 languages, not because they had received formal language instruction, but because the social environment they grew up in exposed them to multiple languages from infancy and the human language acquisition system. The specific cognitive machinery that allows children to absorb language from their environment with an ease and completeness that adults cannot replicate did the rest. The specific functions of language in the pre-civilized world included all the functions that language serves in any human society: the coordination of group activity, the transmission of knowledge, the maintenance of social relationships, the expression of emotion and identity, the narration of the past and the planning of the future, and the specific function that distinguishes human language most dramatically from animal communication systems: the transmission of information about things that are not present in the immediate environment. This last function, the ability to talk about things that are absent, past, future, hypothetical, or entirely imaginary, is what the linguist Charles Hockett called displacement. And it is the specific property of human language that makes the cumulative cultural learning that defines the human lineage possible. The animal that can communicate only about the immediate present, the food here, the predator there, the specific sensory experience of the current moment, is an animal whose knowledge cannot accumulate across generations. The animal that can talk about the past and the future and the imaginary can tell its children what happened before they were born and what might happen after they die, can transmit the knowledge of generations that no individual could have accumulated in a single lifetime. Displacement is what made the songlines possible, the encoding of geographic information about places the singer has never been, in songs that tell the story of the ancestral journey through the landscape. It is what made the transmission of the medicinal plant knowledge possible. The description of plants that are not currently present, the instruction about what to do in situations that have not yet arisen, the communication of knowledge about the future that the teacher will not be there to supervise. It is what made the cave art possible, the representation of animals that were not in the cave, the communication of visual information about the world outside to people who were looking at a cave wall inside. Language was not invented by civilization. Civilization was made possible by language, by the specific cognitive tool that allowed the cumulative cultural learning, the complex social coordination, and the information transmission across generations that the civilizational project required. The languages of the pre-civilized world were not cruder or simpler precursors to the languages of civilization. They were the fully realized expression of the same cognitive capacity applied to the specific communicative requirements of the pre-civilized social world. Chapter 9. The violence. What the actual evidence shows about conflict before civilization. The spear point is in the vertebra, the specific, anatomically precise location of the stone projectile point embedded in the lumbar vertebra of the skeleton. From the Natarok site in Kenya, a site dated to approximately 10,000 years ago, at the very cusp of the transition to the Neolithic in some parts of the world, is one of the most directly disturbing pieces of evidence in the archaeology of prehistoric violence, and it is part of a body of evidence that makes the question of pre-civilized violence one of the most contentious in the study of human origins. The Natarok site contains the remains of at least 27 individuals, including men, women, and children, showing evidence of violent death, the blunt force trauma, the projectile wounds, the bound hands, that the skeletal analysis has identified as the characteristic signatures of massacre rather than of individual conflict. This is not the violence of a hunting accident or a single combat. It is the organized killing of a group by another group, and it is 10,000 years old. The evidence for violence in the pre-civilized world is real, documented, and spread across the full temporal range of the archaeological record. But the interpretation of this evidence, what it means about the nature of human violence before civilization, how frequent it was, what its causes were, and how it compares to the violence of the civilized period, is one of the most energetically contested questions in the field, with significant disagreement between researchers whose interpretations reflect not just different readings of the evidence, but different theoretical frameworks and sometimes different political commitments. The Hobbesian position that the pre-civilized world was characterized by endemic, brutal violence, and that civilization's primary achievement was the reduction of violence through the monopoly of force that the state represents, has been defended in recent years by the psychologist Steven Pinker, whose 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, argued that violence has declined dramatically over human history, with the pre-state world being significantly more violent per capita than the modern state-organized world. Pinker's argument draws on the skeletal evidence for violence in pre-civilized populations, the percentage of skeletal remains showing signs of violent death, and on the comparative ethnographic evidence from recent hunter-gatherer societies, arguing that both sources support the conclusion that the pre-civilized world was significantly more violent than the modern world, when violence is measured as a percentage of deaths rather than as an absolute number. The opposing position, associated with anthropologists, including Douglas Fry and R. Brian Ferguson, argues that the evidence for endemic warfare in the pre-civilized world is much weaker than Pinker's account suggests, that many of the skeletal samples Pinker cites are not representative of the typical pre-civilized population, and that the comparative ethnographic evidence from truly mobile, low-density hunter-gatherer societies, as opposed to the more sedentary, complex hunter-gatherer societies that were already proto-agricultural in some respects, shows significantly lower rates of organized violence than Pinker's figures indicate. The distinction between different types of violence is important here, and its neglect is one of the sources of confusion in the debate. The distinction between individual violence, the fight, the murder, the assault that arises from personal conflict, and collective violence, the organized killing of members of another group, the warfare that requires coordinated action by multiple people against multiple targets, is biologically and socially significant, and the evidence for each is different in character and distribution. Individual violence, the evidence of single injuries from interpersonal conflict, is present throughout the archaeological record, from some of the earliest modern human skeletal remains. This is not surprising. Individual conflict is a feature of social species generally, and the specific interpersonal conflicts that the band's social dynamics produced, the disputes over mating partners, the accumulation of grievance, the specific conflicts of personality that the close quarters of the band inevitably generated, would have produced individual violence in the pre-civilized world as they produce it in every other human social context. The collective violence, the organized killing of other groups, is a different matter, and the archaeological evidence for it in the early pre-civilized period is less extensive and more geographically concentrated than the simple prehistoric humans were constantly at war narrative suggests. The sites of clear, unambiguous massacre, the Naturex site, the Crow Creek site in South Dakota dated to approximately 700 years ago, are real and important evidence, but they are not the universal feature of pre-civilized life that the Hobbesian narrative requires them to be. The most careful synthesis of the current evidence suggests that the rate of collective violence in the pre-civilized world was variable, significantly variable, depending on the specific environmental and social context. The sparse, mobile, low-density hunter-gatherers of the open grasslands appear to have had significantly lower rates of organized warfare than the denser, more sedentary, more resource-circumscribed populations of the late pre-civilized period, particularly in the areas where the transition to agriculture was beginning to concentrate populations around specific resource patches that were worth fighting over. The specific social dynamics of the mobile band were, in important respects, effective at preventing the kind of escalating conflict that organized warfare requires. The ability to move, to take the band elsewhere when a conflict with a neighboring group threatened to become serious, was a conflict management option that the mobile hunter-gatherer had, and that the settled agricultural villager did not. The threat of conflict that in a sedentary community would have to be resolved through fighting could, in the mobile band, often be resolved through the simpler, less costly option of moving the band away from the source of the conflict. The interband relationships that the mobile hunter-gatherer world maintained, the visiting, the trading, the sharing of mating partners, the reciprocal hospitality, were the specific social technologies that maintained the relationships between bands at a level that reduced the risk of conflict escalating to violence. The bands that traded with each other and shared marriage partners were bands with specific personal relationships that made the members of the other band not abstract enemies, but known individuals with known families and known histories. And the killing of known individuals with known families is psychologically more costly than the killing of abstract enemies. This does not mean the pre-civilized world was peaceful. It means that the specific conditions of the mobile, low-density, socially networked hunter-gatherer life provided specific conflict management resources that reduced the rate of organized violence below what the Hobbesian narrative requires, and below what the denser, more sedentary populations of the late pre-civilized and early civilizational period experienced. The transition to agriculture and the beginning of civilization appear, in the skeletal record, to be associated with an increase in organized violence. The specific signatures of warfare in the populations of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age being more frequently found than in the preceding Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations of the same regions. The civilization that was supposed to have reduced violence appears in its early period to have been associated with an increase in it. The specific violence of the state formation process, of the conflicts over agricultural land, of the social hierarchies, and the resource concentrations that agriculture made possible, and that were worth fighting over in ways that the mobile, storageless hunter-gatherer economy was not. Chapter 10. The Children. How pre-civilized children grew up. The child is running, not running toward anything in particular or away from anything specific. Running in the specific, purposeless, exuberant way of a healthy 5-year-old who has discovered that running is one of the things bodies are for, and who is applying this discovery with the comprehensive commitment of someone for whom the discovery is still new enough to be thrilling. The other children are running too, in the loose, unstructured, self-organizing way of children left to their own devices in a space that allows it, and the adults at the edge of the camp are watching with the relaxed attention of people who know where the children are and are satisfied that the immediate environment contains no threats that require intervention. The childhood of the pre-civilized world was not the childhood of the modern West, with its school schedules and organized activities, and the specific structured management of children's time that the modern conception of childhood requires. But it was also not the grim, labor-bound childhood of the early industrial period, the child workers of the 19th century factories, whose exploitation the modern conception of childhood was partly constructed in reaction to. The childhood of the hunter-gatherer band was, and here the comparative ethnographic evidence from recent hunter-gatherer societies is remarkably consistent, characterized by a degree of freedom and play that the modern child, with their scheduled activities and supervised playdates and age-stratified peer groups, would find extraordinary. The hunter-gatherer child played extensively and freely in the mixed age groups that the small band naturally produced in the outdoor environment of the camp and its immediate surroundings, with the materials that the environment provided and the imagination that the play context generated. The developmental psychologist Peter Gray, whose research on play and learning has drawn extensively on the comparative ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer childhood, has argued that the specific qualities of hunter-gatherer children's play, the freedom, the self-direction, the mixed ages, the continuous access to the natural environment, were the developmental conditions for which the human child's brain was specifically designed by evolution. The human child's extraordinary drive toward play, the specific urgent motivation to play that requires no external reward and that children will pursue at the cost of almost any competing activity, is, on this account, the evolved mechanism for acquiring the specific skills and knowledge that the hunter-gatherer life required: the physical competence, the environmental knowledge, the social skills of negotiation and conflict resolution that the play context develops through the years of childhood. The learning of the pre-civilized child was not organized into the discrete, subject-specific, age-stratified curriculum of the modern school. It was the continuous, contextual, socially embedded learning of a child embedded in the full activity of the community, observing the adults participating in the work at whatever level their age and ability permitted, asking questions and receiving answers in the specific context of the activity that generated the question, and practicing through play the skills that the adult community was demonstrating through work. The mixed age play group was one of the specific features of this learning environment that the developmental literature identifies as important. The older child who is playing with a younger child is practicing the skills of teaching, of managing relationships with people of different abilities, of regulating their own behavior in the service of the shared play that the age difference makes easier to disrupt. The younger child who is playing with older children is being exposed to skills and concepts that are slightly beyond their current capacity, but within the range of what the social and physical context of the play makes comprehensible. The specific developmental sweet spot that the educational psychologist Lev Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. The specific content of hunter-gatherer children's play reflected the specific content of the adult world they were growing into. The children who played at tracking animals, who practiced the stalking and the recognition of animal signs in the landscape around the camp, were not just playing, they were acquiring the foundational skills of the adult hunter's knowledge in the specific, low-stakes, self-directed context of play that made the learning both effective and intrinsically motivated. The children who played house, who set up their own small camps and organized their own small social worlds, were practicing the domestic skills and the social management that the adult band life would require. The transition from childhood to adult status in the pre-civilized band was marked by the initiation rituals that the comparative ethnography reveals as near universal features of hunter-gatherer societies. The initiation, the ritual passage that transformed the child into the adult member of the community, was one of the most important social institutions of the pre-civilized world, and its specific forms varied dramatically across cultures, while sharing certain structural features that the cross-cultural comparison reveals as constant. The physical ordeals that many initiation rituals included, the scarification, the tattooing, the specific tests of endurance and pain tolerance, are often interpreted in modern accounts as arbitrary, cruelty, or as the expression of the domination of the elder generation over the younger. The anthropological interpretation is more nuanced. The physical ordeal of initiation served multiple functions simultaneously, including the demonstration to the community that the initiate had the physical and psychological resilience that the adult life required, the creation of the specific social bond between age mates who had undergone the same experience together, and the transformation of the initiate's self-understanding from child to adult through the specific, dramatic, physically marked event that made the transition psychable in the most direct possible way. The knowledge transmitted during initiation, the specific cultural, cosmological, and practical knowledge that the adult status authorized the initiate to receive, was one of the most important functions of the initiation complex. The initiation was not just a rite of passage in the social sense. It was a knowledge transmission event, the formal occasion on which the community's most important and most sensitive knowledge was conveyed to the next generation in the specific ceremonial context that marked the knowledge as important and the recipient as authorized to receive it. The relationship between the generations in the pre-civilized band was organized around the mutual dependence that the band's survival required. The children needed the adults for the food, the protection, the knowledge, and the social support that their biological immaturity made necessary. The adults needed the children for the biological continuation of the group and for the practical assistance that even young children could provide. The elders needed the younger adults for the physical support that aging gradually required. The younger adults needed the elders for the accumulated knowledge and social wisdom that the elders' longer experience had produced. This mutual dependence was not sentimental. It was structural. The band's functioning required the contribution of every age category, and the social norms that organized the relationships between age categories reflected this functional interdependence. The care of children in the pre-civilized band was not the exclusive responsibility of the biological parents. It was distributed across the band in the specific way that the concept of alloparenting, the care of children by individuals other than the biological parents, describes. The alloparenting of the hunter-gatherer band was one of the specific features of human child rearing that distinguished it from the child rearing of the other great apes, and that may have been one of the key evolutionary factors enabling the extended human childhood that is itself one of the distinctive features of the human life history. the human child's extended period of dependency, longer than any other primates, requiring years of intensive care before the child can contribute meaningfully to its own subsistence, was possible in the evolutionary context only because the care was distributed across the band rather than falling exclusively on the biological parents. The grandmother, the older siblings, the aunt, the childless band members who had time and affection to invest in the children of others, all of these participated in the care that the human child's extended dependency required. Chapter 11. The Transition. What happened when civilization arrived, and what was lost, as well as gained. The wild wheat is growing at the edge of the camp. You have been watching it for 2 seasons now. The way it comes up in the same place each year. The way the seeds fall and reseed themselves in the disturbed ground around the camp. The way the dense patch near the water has been expanding gradually as the fallen seeds take root in the rich soil of the flood margin. You have been harvesting the wild seeds for as long as anyone in the band can. Remember, the specific technique of beating the grain-heavy stalks over a basket, collecting the seeds that fall, grinding them between flat stones into the coarse flour that the simple flatbread requires. This year, something different occurs to you, or someone in your band, or someone in the band to the north whose territory borders yours, and with whom you share the seasonal aggregation site. Someone, somewhere, at some point in the long, gradual, regionally varied transition that the archaeological record documents, made the specific conceptual leap from harvesting wild plants to planting them. The transition from the hunter-gatherer way of life to the agricultural way of life. The Neolithic Revolution, as the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe called it in the 1930s, was one of the most consequential transitions in human history, and it is a transition whose causes and character the archaeological research of the past several decades has significantly revised from the simpler story that earlier accounts told. The earlier story was the story of progress. Humans discovered agriculture, recognized its superiority to the hunting and gathering that preceded it, and adopted it rationally because it produced more food, more security, and the surplus that enabled civilization. This story has the appealing clarity of a logical sequence, and it has the significant disadvantage of being substantially wrong about several of its key features. The transition to agriculture was not rapid. In the regions where it occurred earliest, the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley and the wild progenitors of sheep and goats were available for domestication. The archaeological record documents a transition that took thousands of years, not the decades or centuries that a rational adoption of a superior technology would require. The people of the Natufian culture in the Levant, dated to approximately 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, were harvesting wild grains intensively and living in semi-sedentary settlements before any domesticated plant species appear in the record. The full package of agriculture, the domesticated plants and animals, the fully sedentary village, the food storage, accumulated gradually over millennia rather than appearing as a package that someone invented and adopted. The transition to agriculture was also not universal. The hunter-gatherer way of life persisted alongside the agricultural way of life for thousands of years in many regions and in some environments, the Arctic, the deep desert, the dense tropical forest. It persisted until very recent times, or persists still in diminishing pockets. The adoption of agriculture was not the inevitable universal response to an obviously superior technology. It was the context-specific response of specific populations in specific environments who faced specific pressures that made the intensification of food production, but with all its costs, the best available option in their specific situation. What were those costs? The skeletal evidence we have discussed, the worse nutrition, the increased disease, the reduced stature, was one. The loss of the specific quality of life that the hunter-gatherer existence provided was another. And it is a cost that the biological evidence documents, but that the cultural and psychological dimensions of the transition also reveal. The loss of mobility was the most fundamental change that the transition to agriculture produced. The mobile band that followed the food through the landscape, that knew its territory as a lived space traversed and inhabited and known, became the sedentary village population that was tied to the specific patch of land whose cultivation sustained it. The freedom to move, the specific conflict management option, the specific response to environmental adversity, the specific dimension of autonomy that the mobile life provided. Chuar was given up in the adoption of the agricultural life, and the giving up was permanent and consequential. The loss of the social equality of the band was another cost of the transition. The specific social dynamics of the mobile, storageless hunter-gatherer life, the impossibility of accumulating resources in quantities that could be converted into durable social power, the continuous social pressure of the leveling mechanisms that prevented individual domination, were transformed by the specific social dynamics of the agricultural life, which made accumulation possible and made the social hierarchies that accumulation enabled possible. The first farmers were probably not significantly more unequal than the hunter-gatherers they replaced, but the agricultural life created the conditions for inequality to develop in ways that the hunter-gatherer life had structurally prevented. The loss of the knowledge diversity of the hunter-gatherer world was perhaps the most invisible and the most consequential of the transition's costs. The extraordinary breadth of the hunter-gatherers' ecological knowledge, the hundreds of plant species known and used, the comprehensive understanding of the local ecosystem, the specific, intimate relationship with the full complexity of the natural world, was progressively replaced by the narrower, deeper knowledge of the farmer, whose life organized around a small number of domesticated species, and whose understanding of the natural world contracted as the managed, simplified world of the cultivated field expanded. The languages that the hunter-gatherer world had produced over the millennia of its existence, the extraordinary diversity of 10,000 or more distinct languages that the pre-agricultural world maintained, were vulnerable in ways that the agricultural and civilizational expansion made actual. The agricultural populations, with their higher density and their greater organizational complexity, expanded at the expense of the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered. And the expansion brought not just the agricultural economy, but the languages of the expanding agricultural populations, which replaced the languages of the hunter-gatherers they displaced in the specific, irreversible way that language death operates. The last speakers die, and the language disappears, taking with it the specific knowledge, the specific ways of categorizing the world, the specific stories and songs and ritual formulations that only that language encoded. What was gained is equally real. The agricultural surplus that made civilization possible was not nothing. It was the foundation of the art, the philosophy, the science, the literature, the music, the technology, the accumulated cultural achievement that the civilization of the past 12,000 years has produced. The specific achievements of the civilizational period, the things that you, as a modern person reading this, have access to that the hunter-gatherer did not, are extraordinary, and dismissing them in the service of a romantic account of the pre-civilized life would be as dishonest as the dismissal of the pre-civilized life in the service of a triumphalist account of civilization's progress. The question is not whether civilization was good or bad. It is not a question that admits that simple an answer. The question is what was gained and what was lost, and whether the accounting has been honest, whether the story that civilization tells about itself and about the pre-civilized world that preceded it has been accurate about both sides of the ledger. The honest accounting shows a world before civilization that was not the brutish, miserable, violent precursor that the civilizational narrative required it to be. It shows a world of extraordinary knowledge, genuine social intelligence, creative achievement, and the specific comprehensive humanity of people who were solving the problems of their specific world with the same cognitive capacities that we bring to the problems of ours. It also shows a world of genuine hardship, the infant mortality, the untreatable infections, the specific physical demands of a life organized around the daily acquisition of food, and the daily management of the risks that the natural world presented. The transition to agriculture and civilization was not made by people who were perfectly happy with their lives and were dragged reluctantly into a worse existence. It was made by people who were responding to specific pressures and specific opportunities in the specific way that humans have always responded to pressures and opportunities, by trying new things, keeping what worked, and living with the consequences. The consequences included us, the civilization embedded, technologically augmented, extraordinarily comfortable by pre-civilized standards, and yet persistently dissatisfied modern humans who are reading this script and wondering about the 361 days of the year that came before the 4 days of civilization that we know. Chapter 12. The Trade: How Pre-Civilized Humans Exchanged Goods Across Vast Distances. The shell is from the coast. You are approximately 800 kilometers from the nearest coastline in the interior of the continent, in a camp that has never been closer to the ocean than the mountains visible on the western horizon on a clear day. And yet the shell, the specific, unmistakable marine shell that could only have come from the sea, is here, in your camp, worn smooth by handling and pierced for stringing on the necklace of the woman who has worn it every day since her mother gave it to her, and her mother received it from the trader who passed through 2 seasons before that, and the trader received it from the coastal people who collected it from the beach where the shells wash up in the specific season when the southerly current brings them inshore. The shell has traveled 800 kilometers, not in a single journey, not carried by a single person the entire distance, but through the specific relay-like process of exchange that the pre-civilized world developed as its primary mechanism for moving objects, and the information that accompanied them. Across the distances that separated the bands whose territories covered the landscape, the evidence for long-distance trade in the pre-civilized world is one of the most consistently surprising findings of the archaeology of the Stone Age. And it is surprising because it contradicts the image of the isolated, self-sufficient band that the popular imagination has placed at the center of the pre-civilized world. The bands were not isolated. They were connected through the networks of exchange and relationship that the trade goods make visible in the archaeological record in ways that the social relationships themselves cannot be directly preserved. The obsidian tells the story most clearly. Obsidian, the volcanic glass that fractures with a predictable, controllable sharpness that made it one of the finest tool-making materials available in the pre-metal world, was produced at specific geological locations where the volcanic activity that created it had occurred, and the specific chemical composition of obsidian from different sources is distinctive enough that the geological source of any given piece of obsidian can be identified through the geochemical analysis of the stone. When archaeologists apply this analysis to the obsidian found at Stone Age sites across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, the results consistently reveal that obsidian was being transported enormous distances from its geological sources. The obsidian from the Anatolian sources of central Turkey, the volcanic obsidian of the Cappadocian highlands, appears at archaeological sites across the Levant, Cyprus, and the eastern Mediterranean, in some cases hundreds of kilometers from the nearest geological source. The obsidian from Sardinia appears at sites on the Italian mainland and in southern France. The obsidian from specific African volcanic sources appears at sites distributed across wide geographic areas. These are not the distances that a single person walked to get a piece of stone. They are the distances that the relay trade covered. The exchange from band to band, each exchange moving the material a relatively short distance, but the cumulative effect of multiple exchanges across multiple band territories, producing the extraordinary geographic reach that the distribution maps reveal. The specific distances that individual pieces of obsidian traveled in the pre-civilized world are remarkable. Obsidian from the Melos source in the Aegean has been found at sites in the Greek mainland dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, a distance of approximately 150 kilometers across open water, which implies not just the trade network but the watercraft technology that the sea crossing required. The presence of Melian obsidian at pre-agricultural mainland sites is evidence of both long-distance trade and maritime capability that the popular image of the primitive pre-civilized human does not accommodate. The shell beads that the archaeological record reveals at pre-civilized sites across the world were another major category of long-distance trade goods, and the specific shells found far from any coast. The spondylus shells of the Andean region, found at sites hundreds of kilometers from the Pacific coast. The dentalium shells of the Pacific coast, found at sites deep in the interior of North America. The specific marine shells that the Natufian sites of the Levantine interior contain are the direct evidence of the trade networks, whose geographic reach the distribution of coastal materials in interior sites makes visible. The ochre trade was another dimension of the pre-civilized exchange economy, whose geographic reach the archaeological evidence reveals. The specific sources of ochre, the geological locations where the iron oxide deposits of high quality for pigment production were found, were not universally distributed across the landscape, and the high-quality ochre from productive sources was traded across significant distances to the bands whose territories lacked adequate local sources. The specific chemical signatures of ochre from different geological sources can, like the obsidian, be traced to their origin, and the distribution of specific ochre sources at sites far from those sources is the archaeological evidence of the ochre trade. What was being exchanged in return for these materials? The asymmetry of the preserved archaeological record. The stone and the shell survive. The perishable organic materials do not. Means that we can see only one side of the exchange economy in most cases. The food, the hides, the fiber, the wooden objects, the knowledge, the stories, the ritual services, the marriage, partners. All of these were almost certainly part of the exchange economy of the pre-civilized world, and none of them leave the kind of direct archaeological trace that the obsidian and the shell leave. The anthropological record of recent hunter-gatherer exchange systems provides the interpretive framework for understanding what the archaeological evidence reveals. The Kungsan of the Kalahari maintained an exchange system called H-Exaro, a network of gift relationships between individuals in different bands, through which objects circulated across the social network in a continuous flow of giving and receiving that maintained the relationships between exchange partners as its primary function, with the movement of goods as its secondary function. The H-Exaro system was not trade in the market sense, not the exchange of specific goods for specific return goods at a specific ratio of value. It was the maintenance of social relationships through the medium of giving, with the expectation that the relationship would continue to be maintained through future giving in both directions, but without the specific immediate reciprocity of the market exchange. The object given was less important than the relationship maintained by the giving, and the network of Axero relationships that an individual maintained was their social insurance. The network of people across the landscape who were obligated by the relationship to provide support in times of need. This social insurance function of the long-distance exchange network was one of its most practically important features in the specific ecological context of the hunter-gatherer world. The band whose local territory had experienced a drought, whose food resources had failed in the current season, had the option, if they had maintained the exchange relationships, of calling on the bands in whose territories the failure had not occurred, drawing on the social credit that the exchange relationship had built over the years of reciprocal giving. The band that had no exchange relationships, that had been isolated from the wider social network, was the band most vulnerable to the local environmental failures that the hunter-gatherer world's unmanaged ecology produced at irregular intervals. The investment in the exchange relationship was therefore simultaneously a social investment and an ecological insurance policy, and the long-distance exchange networks that the obsidian and the shell distributions reveal were the specific physical expression of a social insurance system whose function was as important as the objects that moved through it. The information that traveled with the trade goods was another of the exchange network's critical functions. The trader who arrived from the north with obsidian and shell also arrived with knowledge. The knowledge of what the bands to the north had seen, what the game populations were doing in the territories beyond the local horizon, what the weather patterns had been, what social and political developments had occurred in the bands whose territories the trader had passed through. This information was as valuable as the objects, and the trader who combined material goods with fresh information was providing a service to the receiving band that went well beyond the material content of the exchange. The knowledge of resource distribution across the wider landscape, the specific locations of productive plant food patches, of reliable water sources, of the seasonal movements of game animals, was the kind of geographic knowledge that extended beyond any individual band's territory, and the exchange network was one of the primary mechanisms through which this wider geographic knowledge was accumulated and distributed. The band that maintained active exchange relationships with bands across a wide geographic area had access to information about conditions across that entire area, which was a significant advantage in the management of the seasonal and annual variability that the hunter-gatherers' unmanaged food supply produced. The marriage exchange was the deepest and most consequential form of the long-distance exchange that the pre-civilized world maintained. The practice of exogamy, the social rule, near universal in hunter-gatherer societies, requiring marriage partners to be found outside the immediate social group, was the specific institution that made the long-distance social network not just a trading convenience, but a biological necessity. The band that married only within itself was the band accumulating the inbreeding depression that close biological relationship in mating produces. And the social rule of exogamy was the cultural institution that enforced the biological imperative of genetic outbreeding. The practical consequence of the exogamy rule was that every band was connected to at least the neighboring bands through the marriage ties that the rule required, and those marriage ties were the deepest and most durable of the social bonds that the exchange network maintained. The woman who had grown up in one band and married into another was a living connection between the two bands, a person with full membership in her current band and deep personal relationships in her birth band, whose position made her simultaneously an insider in both and a bridge between them. The network of marriage ties across the landscape of hunter-gatherer bands was therefore a network of genuine personal relationships, not the abstract commercial relationships of the market trade, but the specific, emotionally real relationships between people who had grown up together, who had shared the specific experiences of childhood and initiation, and the full texture of the pre-civilized life. The exchange that flowed through these personal relationship networks was embedded in the social reality of people who knew and cared about each other, and the reliability and the generosity of the exchange reflected this personal foundation in ways that the impersonal market exchange does not. The pre-civilized world was not a world of isolated bands, each surviving alone in its separate territory, with no knowledge of or connection to the wider human world. It was a networked world, connected across the landscape by the exchange of objects and information and marriage partners and stories and songs and the specific social capital of the relationship maintained through the years of reciprocal giving. The shell 800 kilometers from the coast and the obsidian hundreds of kilometers from its geological source are the visible, preserved evidence of these connections, the physical traces of a social network whose full extent and full complexity the perishable majority of its content has not preserved, but whose existence the surviving evidence makes undeniable. The bands were connected. They always were. The connection was not civilization's invention. It was humanity's inheritance. The specific, socially intelligent, geographically extensive network of human relationships that the same social brain that built the cities had been building in a different form for hundreds of thousands of years before the first city was conceived. The shell around the woman's neck has traveled 800 kilometers. It carries with it the relationships, the exchanges, the specific human connections that moved it from the hand that picked it up on the beach to the hand that wears it now. It is not just an ornament, it is a record, the physical record of the networked, connected, fully social world that humans built before civilization gave them the tools to build something larger. It is enough. It has always been enough. Conclusion: the fire is burning low. The camp is quiet in the specific way of a camp where most of the people have gone to sleep, where the children have finally stopped running and been settled into the shared warmth of the sleeping space, where the adults who stayed awake the longest are sitting in the firelight in the comfortable silence of people who have been in each other's company long enough that silence is as natural as conversation. One of the older members of the band is telling a story, not loudly, quietly, in the specific register of the late evening story that is partly for the adults still awake and partly for the children who are supposed to be asleep but are listening anyway. The story is about the time, long ago before memory, when the world was different, when the animals spoke, and the landscape was shaped by the actions of the beings whose adventures the story describes. The story is not history in the modern sense. It is not an accurate description of events that occurred at a specific time and place. It is something else, the specific kind of knowledge that the story form encodes, the understanding of how the world works, and why it is the way it is, and what the human relationship to the natural world should be, packaged in the narrative form that the human memory most effectively preserves and the human attention most readily follows. This is what humans did before civilization. All of it. The tracking and the gathering and the fire making and the shelter building and the child rearing and the conflict management and the trading and the navigation and the art and the music and the ritual and the storytelling. And between all of these things, the same things that humans do in every period and every context, the loving and the grieving, the laughing and the arguing, the wondering about the sky, and the worrying about the future, and the specific comprehensive daily experience of being alive in a world that is both dangerous and beautiful. The pre-civilized human was not waiting for civilization to begin. They were not an incomplete version of the person that civilization would eventually produce. They were the person, the fully realized, cognitively modern, socially complex, creatively capable person, living the life that the specific conditions of their world made possible and required. The 361 days before the 4 days of civilization were not a prelude. They were the main text. They were the period in which the human animal became human, in which the social intelligence, the language, the art, the spiritual life, the accumulated practical knowledge, the specific, extraordinary capacity for cooperation and creativity that defines the species were developed and refined and passed on through the generations. Civilization inherited all of this. The writing systems that civilization invented were applied to a cognitive capacity for symbolic representation that had been developing for at least 100,000 years. The agricultural organization that civilization built was implemented by the social intelligence and the ecological knowledge that the hunter-gatherer world had refined across 300,000 years. The art and the music and the storytelling that civilization produced were the institutional expressions of creative capacities that the cave painters and the bone flute players and the storytellers around the fire had been exercising since long before anyone built a city. The fire at the edge of the camp is almost out now. The storyteller has finished. The band is asleep. Tomorrow, the same problems: the food, the water, the weather, the relationships, the endless, fascinating, difficult, rewarding project of being human together in the world. Tomorrow, the same solutions: the knowledge, the cooperation, the creativity, the specific genius of a species that has been solving these problems for 300,000 years and has gotten quite good at it. The stars overhead are the same stars. The darkness is the same darkness. And the people sleeping in the camp are the same people, the same cognitive architecture, the same emotional range, the same capacity for love and grief and humor and wonder, who would eventually, 290,000 years later, build the first city and begin the chapter of the story that we call civilization. They were not waiting for that chapter. They were living this one fully and completely, in the specific, extraordinary way that humans have always lived, with everything they had in the world they had, making it as good as they could make it. That is what humans did before civilization. That is what humans have always done. The fire goes out, the stars remain.